Right, with a little bit of encouragement, these screws came loose, and yes, there's certainly corrosion on those. There's one screw at the top and that's got corrosion on it too. These screws are blackened, but they're steel screws, they've been blackened. Most of the other screws are nickel plated, but the nickel plating will have protected screws against corrosion to some extent. So the blackened screws are the only ones showing problems. Just going to uncover the screw on the base, which is hidden under the glue. That doesn't want to come out. It's going to need some hammer treatment. So using an old heavy duty screwdriver as an impact driver, just give that a couple of taps. That was it. Was it? No. There it is. That's all the screws out of the struts. And the struts should lift out. Recover the spring from the front, from the shutter. There's our transfer shaft, the bracket that holds that transfer shaft in place, and there is a spacer washer which takes the same place at the bottom of the camera that the bracket for the transfer shaft took at the top. That's it, that's the body empty, and all of this I need to clean now, make sure I get rid of all bits of grit and dust and any old oil. I'm looking closely to see if there are ice bump problems, but to tell the truth there aren't. That's a very good example. The struts themselves, let's have a look at these. Well, here I can see a sort of a white powdery deposit. Now that will definitely be corrosion, and that's where water has been between this and the camera body shell, which is aluminium. And if I look down in here, I can see a lot of filth down there, sort of crusty looking stuff. So that's almost certainly part and parcel of the same issue with the shutter. And here I'm looking closely at the state of this rail that the shutter release runs on to see if there's any corrosion or stiffness to that action. It looks okay. I think this will clean up okay. These marks are inconsequential because they're tucked down in the body where no one can see them. And the struts themselves, I'm looking to see if they're bent. There's that one slightly bent, but you'd hardly know. They look quite good actually. Right, well I need to gather together all the pieces that are going into the degreaser and then onto the ultrasonic cleaner. Any components with paint on them, I do not put them through that process because the paint comes off and then I'd have to put it back again. And I don't normally do the film take-up spool or sprocket or this piece because it's got paint on it. The springs I don't normally do. So I can see that the screws that hold the bellows to the back of the front standard, there's a bit of rust on those. That's not unusual because they're travelling, they go through a felt light trap that's on the back of the front standard, and anything fabric related or leather related or anything of that nature tends to hold moisture, and so you end up with corrosion problems just from humidity. Of course, that Retina IIa I did recently, that was an outstanding example of corrosion caused by humidity. Fortunately, you don't see many like that. That spring can go in there, and I'll recover these two screws. Oh yes, there's definitely signs of corrosion. This was the surround for the tripod socket, and it's got a lot of crusty crap on the bottom there. That's aluminium, it's probably got corrosion on there. I can see some around the edge. And the frame counter stuff from the top, well, I don't normally put the frame counter spring through the ultrasonic cleaner because I do not want to have to replace one of those at my cost. They're rare and expensive. And of course the number dial never goes through the ultrasonic cleaner because I don't want the paint off that either. Right, so there's my pile of bits to go through the ultrasonic cleaner. The struts I'll clean by hand, likewise all the other pieces that I pulled out. I'll go and get these started. I'm just cleaning up the body now with a bit of naphtha. This lever here, this is the catch for the front door. There's a bit of rust on there, so I want to remove that from the body and just clean that and make sure that I lubricate it when I put it back, just to ensure that it doesn't start sticking. So the button just screws on, and I don't think I can get at that with this tool. I need to find another tool. Well, this tool will do nicely. It's just a cheap pair of crimp pliers. So taking care not to scar that chrome button up too much. Just get that started. It should just come free fairly easily after that, if it's not corroded on. Yeah, it's coming free. That's just a small chrome brass button. Now that lever will slide forward out from underneath the spring. There's its return spring there, and you can see the rusty marks underneath it. But I want to get rid of all that rusty crap. You can see the rust on the back of the lever here. This was obviously, well, it wasn't painted in place because there's paint underneath it in the body, but they only painted the face that you could see, not the back of it. So I'll clean all that off, clean all that rust out from the body there, put a smear of synthetic grease on the back of that to protect it, and put it back together. Looking closely at the camera body now, I can see corrosion on the aluminium boss here. Now that's almost certainly part and parcel of the event that gave us the corrosion of the shutter. There's a lot less of that to the top of the camera, so it suggests that perhaps the camera was put down on something wet, even in a puddle, or it got splashed and mostly it affected the bottom of the camera, not the top. Right, well, I'll start cleaning these surfaces up, and I'm just using cigarette lighter fluid on a cotton bud here. And I just want to get rid of those dirty, rusty patches there, really. I've already brushed out the body here to get rid of any loose grit and dust. And particularly at the back where the transfer gear is, that little idler gear, I need that to be nice and clean so that the cocking rack runs smoothly, or as smoothly as it's going to run. That seems fine. Have a look at this lever. There's a little bit of loose rust on there. I want to see the back of that. I'll do that with a wire brush, I think. I've got one here. Right, well, that's got rid of that rust. And I'll put some synthetic grease on the back of this in particular. And I can be reasonably generous because I want to make sure that those surfaces are well sealed to prevent any excessive corrosion there. Otherwise the lever would be stiff, and of course you press the button and the front won't want to open. Right, so I've got to pull this spring up slightly, slide the base of that lever underneath the spring, line up the screw hole in the base of the camera there, take my button and screw it into place. That's the theory. So it doesn't want to go smoothly because the leather has sort of shrunk around the button, making it tight to screw in. Yeah, I've just screwed that in by my fingers, and now I'll just ensure that it's tight. That's all that took. So that's my catch back in place, and that's moving freely, and probably more importantly there's no corrosion behind it. If I look deeper into the body here, I can see some rust on that screw head down in the recess there. That's not going to cause us any grief. And I will just run a little bit of grease on that. Yeah, it's it only takes a single event in the life of a camera. I mean, this is what, from 53, 54, something like that. That's getting on a bit. Once upon a time, somebody was clumsy and they let it get wet. We're seeing the damage now. It could have happened any time ago. Could have been right back when the camera was comparatively new. Probably was. Right, I'll continue cleaning up this a bit. I'll just need to clean up all of the top body here to make sure there's no dirt and dust. It's looking very clean. I just need to make sure that all that, any dust and grit in particular is the main thing you need to be seeing the back of. That well, if there's grit present, it means that stuff doesn't run smooth. Stuff can jam, stuff can wear out. That all looks good. That is just about all I need to do with that body casting. I'm looking at the state of the shaft here. That's the one that the shutter release runs on. I'm checking it to make sure there's no corrosion on there which would make the shutter release stiff, but it appears to be fine. That looks okay. Let's have a look at the struts. Check that the shutter release moves freely, and it does. I've already checked to see if the struts were bent slightly. One of the struts, can't remember if it was the top or the bottom one, was slightly bent. The bottom one, it's only very slight. I'll give that a little nudge. Yeah, just a wee bit. Square that up a bit. The inner struts should be straight. The outer struts here on the cross arms should have a slight dish to them, so that it's wider here than it is at this point. That provides the impetus to click the buttons into place when the struts are fully extended. If you overdo it, these struts will just be very stiff. So I've got to clean all these surfaces. I could see a little patch of green corrosion there, and I can see a tiny spot of rust on that arm. These arms serve to stop you depressing the buttons if the focus scale ring is not set back to infinity. Of course, if you apply enough force, you can move them anyway. But that's what their purpose is, and they would stop a cautious person or a reasonably cautious person from pressing those buttons in. No accounting for people who aren't reasonably cautious. The struts are quite clean as these sorts of things go. I quite commonly see them well caked in oil and dust and dirt, dried grease that's gone into a hard wax, and all the sand that they could possibly gather up. That seems very good. Those struts could go back in the body in that state, they're good. The focus scale ring, that's just some dried grease on the back there, and we want rid of that. There'll be some on the inside surfaces too. I'll get that all clean. I can see my alignment marks that I made. 2 here and 1 here. And I can see the little dents from where the screw heads bit into it from the focus scale ring. So if I hadn't got alignment marks, I could probably still figure out exactly where it was supposed to go. But it certainly makes it easier if you do have alignment marks. Here's the focus mount itself, and that brown stuff you can see there, that's dried out grease, and all that's got to come off it. There's a little felt gasket, if you like, on the back of this, like a light trap, and I'm just seeing if it'll come off easily. If it won't, I'll leave it in place. Sometimes it's easier to remove it for cleaning purposes when I'm trying to get rid of this filthy waxy grease. So I'm using a toothpick here to run around those surfaces and scrape out the bulk of that grease. Grease like this, it wouldn't have been anywhere near that consistency when it was first put in there. It would probably be quite free running, but the volatiles go and you're just left with this waxy base, and it's a very poor lubricant and it's great as a glue, so it tends to stick things together. Right, let's see if I can get that rest of that crap off there. That's moving quite easily. Sometimes it's very stubborn and then it doesn't want to dissolve with the naphtha, and I have to use other solvents. but that's coming away quite well. Sometimes you find that this casting is distorted. If it's distorted, typically I suppose that means that the camera's been dropped or something at some stage, but then you find that it's quite stiff to adjust the focus. Even after you get it all clean and you get rid of all the old grease and you've got everything as clean as can possibly be, lubricated appropriately, you may find that the action's very stiff, and it'll be because there's distortion in here, and as soon as you tighten the screws up, things don't want to go. If you suspect that, you can lay a straight edge across it and look and see if there seems to be any problem. Typically it means that one of the corners has been pushed back. There's no problem with this one that I can see, it all looks good. Not really expecting any problem with this. Of course it's a bit difficult getting in behind these two posts. They're the guide posts for the inner helical. They ensure that the inner helical can only move forward and back. It doesn't rotate. The outer helical rotates. Yeah, that should be good. What's next here? Another top cover. This is one of a style that Kodak used for a fairly short period of time. It has the serial number stamped on the shoe, not on the top cover. It was probably done as a cost saver, as a time saver, because it's easier to handle a small piece like this and run it through the dies for getting the numbers stamped on it than it would be using whole top covers, and potentially, of course, damaging whole top covers because there's a much bigger area of chrome to damage. So they stamped the serial number on the top, and to make this a secure business they basically had to shift the screws from the outside to the inside. So the screws are on the inside of the top cover, which is a great idea, except screws do tend to rattle themselves loose over time, and when they rattle themselves loose there's no way of tightening them if the bloody screw heads are on the inside of the camera. So the upshot of that is it's not at all uncommon to find cameras with the shoe completely missing because the screws just loosened up and the shoe fell off. If these screws fall out, there's a couple of options. They can rattle around inside the top cover, and typically they will fall out from around the rewind shaft at some handy time, or probably even the advanced shaft. They can also fall into inopportune places, and in the top of the body here we have a gear on the top of the sprocket shaft here and a gear that drives it here, and it's not uncommon for those little screws to find their way down in between those gears and effectively lock the film advance. So if the film advance doesn't want to move and someone gives the lever an extra good push to clear the blockage, don't ask me how people think, then stuff gets broken. Not normally the screw, normally the gears. So yes, all these things flow on from these screws on the inside. The glass for the front here is held in with a bracket. That has our two pieces of glass for the front of the viewfinder and the rangefinder windows. They're very, very dirty. It's much easier to remove them completely to clean them. the rear eyepiece lens here, that's a plain piece of glass. You cannot take that out unless you want to spend a lot of time staking this back in afterwards. You've got to clean it in place. This does not unscrew from the top cover. You'd be amazed at the number of cameras I've seen with chewed up marks around there because some idiot's got a pair of pliers on there to unscrew the eyepiece. I'll clean these components up, especially that glass because that's very, very dirty, and then pop that back together.